So this is a discussion on post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe we'll have you, Nick, explain a little bit about.
Well, post-traumatic stress disorder is well, it's a mental disorder for one. But really, what it is really kind of a complex question. Um, Basically, it is a reaction to some sort of extreme trauma. That could be physical trauma, sexual trauma, psychological trauma. There are so many different ways that one can be traumatized that create a PTSD-like reaction. Um, so, but really, the heart of the diagnosis actually lies in the history of it. So, Nick, tell us what you know about that.
All right. Well, first, to understand the history of PTSD, you kind of have to understand the mind-body medicine connection. For a long time, medical science wants to say that everything is part of the body, and a mental illness is part of the mind. And really, nowadays, we're trying to bridge that disconnect and show that they're the same thing. So, mind-body medicine itself has had to overcome a really sharp social stigma because, people are crazy. And that's all there is to it. They're either crazy or they're sick. And now we're starting to see that what has been considered crazy is an illness, and it's something that can be treated through medicine, but not exclusively. It's part of a physical diagnosis too. So when you're talking about that, you have to understand PTSD has gone through that spectrum of social stigma as well. But I mean, it didn't even show up until DSM-3, which was published in 1980. So that's a lot of time where it wasn't even recognized as a condition. It has, however, had many different names throughout the past. The first mentions of it you really see come around the Civil War time frame. But like right after World War I, it became more prevalent. And I think it was Chamberlain that wrote, modern Western medicine believes that physical illness must have a physical cause. And so that the mind-body argument's embodied right there in that. So, combat-derived physiological conditions, like I said, were very highly stigmatized. Soldiers have always been expected to be tough, not just physically, but mentally. If you go through and you're not tough, then something wrong with you, not something wrong with the environment that you've been exposed to. So, when PTSD first came around, as we see it today, it was not combat related at all. Actually, it's Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, they started using a lot of railways. So everybody was going to and from railways, and not safe by any means. So after crashes, they started noticing that these guys were not doing well. And so they came up with a condition called railway spine. And railway spine, the symptoms were sleep disturbances, nightmares about the collision, tinnitus, intolerance of railway travel, and chronic pain. So that sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? So what they did to answer it, instead of making it a mental condition, is they called it a post-concussion syndrome. So that made sure that it wasn't put in the mind section, it was put in the body section, and they could treat it as an illness. That brings us up to hysteria. Basically, when there was a problem before these formal diagnoses that we talk about today, it was just hysteria. If you were crazy, it's hysteria. And that was a very widely described disease that really didn't fit much of anything, but fit everything. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So let's bring it back to the military. And I like what you said earlier in the definition of it, is that it's about trauma. It's not about military.
No.
But the way we see it today is military. And that's why it's gotten so much attention, is because it's been put right in our faces. So a lot of this discussion will be based off military and military history, because that's just how trauma has been researched.
Mm-hmm.
So Civil War observer, Dr. Mendez da Costa, he argued there was more to PTSD. Well, he didn't say PTSD, but there's more to the condition that we see now. First, Civil War doctors diagnosed it as exhaustion. They saw it as, hey, this guy's worn out, he needs rest, so they give him rest, and they send him right back to the front lines. Guess what it didn't solve? This.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Dr. da Costa came up with something called soldier's heart. And he credited it to an overexertion of the central nervous system, particularly the cardiovascular system. And so a lot of the symptoms that we described, you know, the nightmares, the aversion to things, the being scared, was an overtaxation of the central nervous system, so you weren't getting the right blood perfusion, and it manifested in those symptoms. And soldiers' heart stuck through Civil War. Up into World War I. In World War I, they're like, dude, sorry, this is a little too much. It's not soldier's heart. So they came up with the concept of shell shock. If you guys understand a little bit about World War I, the trench warfare stuff, they were subject to extreme bombardments. Because you know, they'd go into these shelters that were dug on the front lines and just concussion after concussion after concussion. And obvious symptom, right? They were in close proximity to bombardments, so they have shell shock. The shell shock is a result of the impact from the rounds going off and is a mental disorder similar to post-concussion disorder. So we're back to that. Again, the mind-body disconnect. So the physical diagnosis carried extreme fatigue, dyspnea, heart palpitations, sweating, tremors, and loss of consciousness. Unfortunately, for the good folks that wanted this to be the real diagnosis, people that weren't in direct bombardment started having the exact same symptoms. So they kind of had to rewind and go back and fix it. But if you're familiar with the way that we treat our post-war efforts, it's forget, downsize, and move on. And that's what happened in World War I. So it popped up again in World War II. And this time, instead of calling it shell shock, they called it combat fatigue. So they kind of combine the old and the new. But at least they recognize that it's not a physical condition. And so it continued again through there. And we came to the end of World War II with lots and lots of people with combat fatigue. And a little more history lesson for you. After World War II, there was the big push to make sure that we took care of our soldiers. That's when the GI Bill first came out, so education benefits, and it was really, really big deal. It was part of the packaged in with the New Deal, because you know the post-depression mindset changed where the government's supposed to take care of us in extreme circumstances, and so this was the first group coming back that said, hey, we took care of you, now take care of us. So they made sure that the GI Bill had not only education benefits and the job stuff, but it had health care, including mental health care. Never before had the government ever said including mental health care at anything, so it was a really big deal. And combat stress was looked at. And this was the first time that they actually started putting in combat psychologists, that's what they called themselves, where they started integrating those into the line units and observing and figuring out what's going on. Even still, combat fatigue is the term that stuck through Vietnam and even into as late as 2000. I remember when I first joined the military, that was something we saw in the book, is combat stress and combat fatigue. So, continued on, and of course, I guess it's a big change from now and then, because back then, in fact, I found a quote from a World War I observer, if I can go back a little bit, that says, the others who were plainly worthless fellows, one without moral sense, had taken a commission under the shadow of compulsion, and sitting there with his head in his hands at the bottom of the trench, he could do no good for the men of 1916. He showed none of the extreme signs of fear. He was a worthless chap without shame, the worst product of the towns. And that's just kind of how they were viewed back then. So that stigma is stuck, and I think that's the biggest thing to take away from that. That stigma has stuck. Even today, guys coming home don't want to seek treatment because it's a sign of weakness, even though there's a whole lot of stuff showing that it's no longer a weakness. So when those psychiatrists went in, they determined that it's not the biggest, the baddest, the toughest that get this. It's, you know, subject to everybody. And they determined that everyone had their breaking point, and that acknowledgement really shifted gears, not just for military psychologists, but for the whole mind-body argument. So I guess that's a good thing we could take away from the recent wars. I don't really want to call it that, but yeah. So that brings us up to the GI Bill, and I think that's the most important part of the history of this PTSD. The GI Bill came out shortly thereafter. The PTSD was published in the DSM-3 back in 1980, and it's an epidemic today, and I know that we're going to talk about today a little bit more, but people call it an epidemic today because it's so much more prevalent. I think it's because they're stripping away the stigma, like we talked about, so it's okay to seek help. That help is out there. It's better developed, and I mean it's a more significant thing. So I guess that kind of brings us into what exactly it is and how it's published in the current DSM. And I think Nick, you had talked about that, haven't you?
Yeah, I actually covered a little bit of both because when I was going through this, I decided, the current DSM is good and well, but kind of harking back to the history of it, we really needed to see the symptoms as they presented in DSM-4 TR, which for a number of years was the major, criterion.
What's TR mean?
I'll be honest with you, it's some kind of Latin phrase.
Okay. It wasn't like a special edition or anything. Okay.
Well, it is. It's. I think it's a Latin phrase that reflects that it was the revised edition, because when they did DSM-4, and then they like a couple of years later they realized, wow, we made a bunch of mistakes, and so they revised it.
Okay.
So it's a revised edition, but for most of the late 80s and 90s, it was the edition that you covered, and we only just got DSM-5 in recent years. So it was one of the longest running editions of DSM that, were there. And really, the symptoms of PTSD in DSMs, in a lot of ways, they're very similar. They're categorized by sexual traumas, physical traumas, social traumas. There's a lot of criterion. Each one goes into each a little different thing. But the basics of it, what it comes down to, really, is the differences between acute and chronic and where it falls on different scales. Because DSM-4 makes these definitions. It says acute is really the duration of the symptoms is less than 3 months, whereas chronic, the duration of symptoms is 3 months or more. And the DSM-5 just doesn't use these definitions. They have some timelines, but they're not quite as hard and fast on those timelines. In DSM-4 they're looking at these timelines plus criterion, and in the DSM-5 they're really looking at more just straight criterion. So really, criterion A for DSM-4, it says the person has been exposed to a traumatic event in which some of these things or all of these things were present. And whereas a person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event that involved actual or threatened death, or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others. So we're talking, take it back to the combat situation. If you're in a gunfight, well, you've got all of that going on, because not only is there violence and that thought where I could die, but you might see your fellows around you dying. So there's that threat of death too. But combat, like you said, combat is not the only place we find this. Gang wars, people living in boroughs, lower areas that have high violence. Anywhere that is high violence, you'll find these kinds of events. Another thing is where that trauma is been re-experienced and re-experienced and re-experienced. And you've got the big thing is the recollections. We've all heard of flashbacks. Well, that's really what these are, is they're recollections of the event. They're dreams, recurring things that remind you of what it is that's going on. So really, the differences between DSM-4 and DSM-5 criterion are minor at best. I could go through the expansive list, but what it comes down to, the bare bones of each one, is these ideas that it's trauma-based. Any kind of trauma can cause PTSD. So when we're looking at symptoms, that's what we're looking for ultimately, is we're looking for the trauma. We're looking for the reactions to trauma. We as clinicians, we can all know Well, we're not clinicians yet, but you get my point. But we can all know, yes, this person was raped. They experienced a trauma. But it's about also, just because you experience a trauma does not necessarily mean you have PTSD.
So it's living it, reliving it.
Reliving it. Maybe even avoiding it. Avoiding things that are along those lines. Because if someone, say, for instance, someone was raped at a Denny's, then they may avoid going to Denny's for the rest of their life because they associate Denny's with this such traumatic event.
It can be more than the place too. It can be like even like the smells of breakfast cooking.
Exactly.
Okay.
Oh yeah, no, it definitely can be those things.
I say a lot of combat vets don't like to drive. They don't drive properly, and there's all kinds of ways.
Activities, places, people, anything that can bring that recollection forth. And one of the things we know now that we didn't know way back when is that, like you said, smells. Those are big triggers for some people.
Oh yeah.
These are new things that we know, and so, it's such a big thing that could cause this, and that I also think that's why we've seen these upswings in cases as well, is because there, like you said, there was a point in time where they were like, okay, well, this is combat related, it's combat derived. And through the years, we realized, no, this is not combat related. And then, of course, after combat, they were like, okay, well, obviously, it's not just combat. It's anyone that's been through something truly horrific. Like witnessing a murder, witnessing a rape, being raped, or just anything that we would consider very, very extreme.
Well, how does it manifest itself?
Oh, big question. It can manifest itself in so many ways. It can, for some, it's extreme nervousness, that exaggerated startle response. For others, it's wariness. They're looking around, always looking over their shoulder. Difficulty concentrating, outbursts of anger. Again, not to harp on the combat vets too much, but that is something that is still part of the stigma, is that when, combat veterans come back from war, they're angry. They're not the people they were, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And this is PTSD at its, not necessarily the finest, but
sure,
at its point, at its peak. And so, and the big thing is with any mental disorder, it's not a disorder unless it causes significant stress on the person. It's just not. So someone could say, yeah, combat was hell, or watching my mother die of cancer was hell, whatever. But unless they can say to you, yeah, this is still bothering me, or if you can see that there's something not going on, they're withdrawn, they're not going to work, they're doing poorly, they're clearly nervous, so
do you think
it's a big thing.
That adds to the stigma right there, what he just said? Because what I heard you say is that it doesn't affect all the same people. So two people right next to each other having the same experience, one has this interference with his life from the symptoms you talked about, the one next to him doesn't. How does, don't you think that leads to one being called weak because they had the reaction?
Most certainly. And it probably was something they even noticed way back when too. They'd be like, well, this guy did it. What happened? Why didn't this guy doing the same thing?
Yeah,
they didn't have that understanding that people react differently. It was one of those things. Kind of based on that scientific method where if you do A and plus B, then C happens. That's pure scientific method, which harking back from the age of industrial revolution, that was everything. Modern medicine was on the rise, science was on the rise. So if you had A person plus B situation, C was always the result. But that's not true, because there's this big black box called humanity, in which you have A person plus B situation plus C, which is personality, environment, background, all sorts of things, which can create, varying results. So it doesn't affect people. It just simply put does not affect people all the same. There's no hard and fast, A plus B equals C, which is one of the reasons I like DSM-5 is because so many things in DSM-5 put things on this spectrum. Yeah. It's not, okay, you have these symptoms, you have this thing. It's, okay, this person's showing these symptoms, but they're showing them to this degree. So this is on the scale, this is where they fall. Between DSM-4 and DSM-5, there's very little difference between the symptoms. But it's about the scale, that range that they've noticed. Because they've said, there are people with smaller amounts of PTSD than others. Just like there's people with varying degrees of autism. Autism is kind of the hallmark for the scale. But it falls on PTSD as well.
So, what do we do about it? I mean, how do you treat PTSD?
Yeah, because the treatment of PTSD, I mean, there's lots of forms, but there's been a few proven ways that PTSD has been shown to be treated. There's individual therapy, there's group and family therapy, and then there's medications that they can use. There's two main ways of individual therapy that that research has shown to be very effective among to treat PTSD. The first is cognitive behavioral therapy, and the second would be EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization. So with cognitive behavioral therapy, kind of the big thing there is one of the big things there is that there's first prolonged exposure, which what they do there is they're able to the person kind of goes back to the event, the traumatic event, and so they imagine it in their minds and they go through it and talk to the therapist about it. And after they're able to talk to the therapist, immediately the therapist discusses what happened in the event and how they can reshape the event and look at it in a more in a different way and how to deal with the stress of it. And that leads also to it's called SIT, or stress inoculation therapy, which is just learning to deal with the different symptoms of the therapy, or different symptoms of the stress that's from the traumatic event. So it doesn't really deal with the traumatic event right on, but just how you deal with the problems it causes in your life. The next part, another type of therapy in the cognitive behavioral therapies is the cognitive processing therapy. And what a lot of that is learning how to, you go through the traumatic event in your mind, and you might journal it, you might just discuss it with the therapist, and then the therapist helps you to look at it in a different light, look at it in different ways on how it affects your life, and helps you to change your thoughts about the thing. Now, something that's kind of like prolonged exposure therapy is what they call EMDR. And the interesting thing about EMDR is that they've shown that it's extremely effective for helping people with trauma, but at the same time, they don't know why it works, they just know it works really well. And the research has shown, it to be highly successful. And
it's the one where they measure eye movements and based on reactions to certain traumas and things, and they help basically condition. Is condition the right word to use?
Yeah, definitely. And conditioning is perfect because they have an outside stimulus affecting it. And
it's kind of like they bob back and forth.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing that that's the main ways. You can have a light. You can have the therapist can move their finger back and forth. They also have it set using sound. They've started using sound a lot more too, where they'll be like the therapist will tap, And they'll be doing this extra stimulation while the person's going through the traumatic event and recounting the traumatic event.
So that sounds like a therapy that's come along to treat the mind-body issue.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's definitely not, I mean, it's physical because you're talking about a physical reaction in the way that's manifested in the brain, but it's also, that's pretty cool how it's really a convergence of the two.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Hopefully that's one of our answers.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, and that's a big thing. Like, I like how you described like that mind-body schism, because that was a big problem, and it's still realistically a problem. We're just only now starting in mental health to really consider the mind a part of the physical body, and be able to but realize that the illnesses that occur to the mind are different than the illnesses that occur to the body, because with the body, it's, I've got a broken arm, I go to the doctor, I get a cast and I get it fixed. With the mind, it's different, which is why I think for so long they kept the two separate. But now they're starting to reintegrate those two together, and so these kinds of therapies, EMDR.
But there's always medications. I mean, medications are still very prevalent. I think
Medications are king.
More of a physical thing. So what kind of medications do you get for PTSD?
Well, it's funny because they found a lot of the medications that work for depression also work for PTSD extremely well. And so you get the two groups are let's see, it's called SSRIs and SNRI. There's a few SNRIs too that work for that also. So you get things like Prozac and Zoloft, and then there's a couple. Like you get Effexor and Trevalor for the SNRIs. And so those things have been proven to be effective for people with PTSD. Another form of treatment that they find really well is group therapy. And the reason why is because in group therapy, you have people that have gone through similar events, whether it be the same type of trauma or even different types of trauma. And it kind of forms that support group. It forms a circle of people that can help you through the problem, and people that where you can realize that you're not alone in what you've gone through.
One of the things that I've found too, and I'm sorry, but I'm all about soldier stuff. It's who I am, it's where I come from, and
well, soldiers are where this diagnosis originated.
The biggest preventer of PTSD is the peer group, the ones that are going through the experience with you. And so the Army's come out with a new program called Resilience Training through the University of Pennsylvania. And like we have current and post-deployment resilience training, we have an overall resilience program, and it's to try to get away that stigma we talked about. That you don't have to be the tough guy. It's about asking for help, about using your peers, understanding some coping mechanisms before you go into it.
Right.
And it's a shame you can't really apply that across the board, because you can't make potential victims of a crime or a trauma, go through classes before they go to the trial.
That
doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, group therapy is so interesting because there's a big stigma around group therapy, because a lot of people who don't know too much about it think, well, it's just a bunch of people sitting around encouraging each other's disorders. Because when it was first established with addiction disorders, that was the big stigma. That's like, oh, well, it's just you're getting a bunch of addicts, and then all they're going to do is share drugs or alcohol. But it turns out it doesn't work that way. There was a quote from Alcoholics Anonymous, the Alcoholics Anonymous book. It said, "There is nothing better than addicts helping addicts." But we've applied that to so many different things, and it's really, the concept is proven effective across the board. So that's why we have these big explosions of group therapies, and they work. Like you said, it's about that community. It's about inclusiveness, because so many of these disorders, no matter whether it's PTSD or depression, there's an isolative factor. And so when you take away that isolative factor, you take away some of its power over the person. And so that's the big thing with groups, is that they take away that isolative power. They show the person, hey, yeah, I'm going through this, but so are you, so are you, so many people.
I think dialogues like this, the continued confluence of mind-body medicine, and more survivors coming back.
Mm-hmm.
There's the body armor, the armored vehicles, those things have made so much greater survival for us, and so many people are coming back from these events that would have killed them before, and that's why it's a bigger upswing for us military guys. Mm-hmm. It's because we have more survivors, people that would have died in other attacks. So, But this kind of wraps up our 30-minute window.
Yeah.
Appreciate you guys coming, and then we'll post our credits at the end here. Are there any other departing comments you guys would like to make?
No, that sounds good.
Thanks for coming, and I learned a lot about PTSD.
That's it up.